Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Blair here with Wisecraft Handmade, and I am here with my friend Bari J. Bari J. Ackerman. She is a fabric designer, really interior stylist and designer, a color aficionado, a pattern aficionado, and she is going to talk us through some thoughts on color and what she's up to. And I thought it would be fun to have her on. Hey, Bari.
Hi, it's so good to see you, Blair.
Good to see you too. And you're in North Carolina, where I grew up.
Yep, about an hour from where you grew up. I'm in Charlotte.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very familiar to me. And the mural in your behind you, is that in your, tell us about it. Did you paint that? I assume you did.
Yeah, I did. I painted that. When we moved in, the walls were gray and the paneling was white, and I had it painted pink. And then I painted the mural on it, and we added the sconces too.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's really
Thank
pretty.
you.
Yeah. So I thought it would be really fun to have you on because I feel like your style and color sensibility and pattern thoughts sort of like permeates through your entire life, like from your wardrobe to your interior, your home's interior, to the fabric that you design and things like that. And tell us a little bit about how that all kind of started and how it kind of evolved to now. I know that's a big question.
It is. Well, I think, definitely coming from a family where my mom was an artist, and she had a cousin who decorated their house when I was probably around 10 years old. And I'm just starting now in my life to realize that so much of what I do comes from my mom's cousin, Bernie. Actually, my mom's cousin, BB's husband, Bernie. So my mom's cousin was BB. She's still alive. Bernie has passed, but Bernie he was larger than life. And literally he's this big man, just so joyous. And he loved design. And so he designed their house, and he did he did like a chintz wallpaper with a mid-century modern dining table that was brass and clean lined, and put Queen Anne chairs with it. And so a lot of those kind of the contrasts and the tension of the contrasts are things that I saw as a young kid. And also the florals, there were just so many florals, and I gravitated towards it. I loved him. I loved what the house looked like, and it is like an essential part of who I am and how I design now. And I didn't realize that really until more recently. I think back on what that house looked like and what he had done in it, and my mom's paintings and all of that. It just really makes a lot more sense to me. But what I had been doing was I was making handbags, and that was my first foray into fabric and sewing. And I started making these handbags, and then months later I started selling the handbags. And it wasn't, my own fabric, it was just fabrics that I had purchased. And I was pretty free and willy-nilly with like my fabric choices. I would go into the local quilt shop and I would buy fabrics, and I didn't know that there were collections of fabrics. So I would just kind of like wander around. I'd pick one here. I'm like, oh, that looks cool. Oh, that would look cool with that. And it wasn't until later that I realized that, I was picking things from different fabric collections. So I was just pulling things that my brain was like, oh, that looks really cool. And I didn't even know what it was that I was doing until I kind of assessed way, way later in my career, like how I was mixing things. So that was my first foray into fabric. And then I eventually started designing fabric, thinking that I was going to use that on my handbags, because it was kind of necessary, because the market was permeated with handbags when Etsy started, because this was 2005 that I started sewing the handbags and selling them. So around, it was 2006, 7, I started realizing, oh, I think I need to do my own fabric. Wasn't sure how. I had a little bit of graphics design background, just only by default, because I was working at a real estate agency in their advertising department, and they had no like official graphic designer. And so I was just by default doing things.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's in the late 90s,
Yeah.
like mid to late 90s. And so I learned some of that. So I had some sort of sense about how things should go together, but I didn't know that I could draw. I just didn't know how I was going to make my fabric collection. I started drawing on a Wacom bamboo graphics tablet, which, if you know, like the series of Wacom tools that are, meant for drawing on. You probably want to tell them what there it is. It's similar to that, but the bamboo was very glidey. It wasn't very precise back then. It was like the $100 version of it. And anyway, the technology has gotten much, much better. So I'm drawing on that into Photoshop, and I'm creating things, and it takes like a year for me to figure it out. And all of a sudden I'm like drawing things that I think like look like what I'm trying to draw. And so I learned to create repeats, and Spoonflower opened at that very time they were in beta testing. I had fabric printed to them, and I went to Quilt Market to try to license the fabric to a fabric company.
I didn't realize that you did Spoonflower fabric first.
Yes, well, it's interesting because no one knew what they were. Nobody knew about digital fabric printing. And so when I came and I had all this fabric that was printed, it used to be, you had to go to New York, and there were digital fabric printers, and it was really just for samples. So people were like, what in the world? How did you get this? And I'm like, well, there's this new company, and this is how I did it. And then I licensed to one company, and I was with them for a while. And then 2 companies later, I ended up with Art Gallery Fabrics.
Did you go to them, or did they come to you? Or
it's interesting because I met Pat Bravo at Quilt Market, probably my first or second Quilt Market that I went to after my fabric launched. And she had not started licensing designers. It was just her at that time.
Her own stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and so she had said at that time, if you ever become available when I'm ready to license artists, I would love for you to join us. And true to her word, when I was ready and she was ready, we joined forces. And so I was the first licensed designer at Art Gallery Fabrics. And so it was, it was new for her, and it was new for me. And it's been really a great fit.
Yeah, because how many collections have you done for them now? A lot.
Oh, I just counted last night. I think it's 16.
That's
for them. So then there's about a total of 20 a total of 20 that have been on the market since I started.
Crazy. But it's such a good lesson for creative people, because you had an idea, and through developing and practicing and putting in the work to do what you wanted to do, you had a vision, and putting in the work to sort of see where that vision would go, you were able to really figure out your aesthetic. It's almost like you didn't go in saying, I'm going to figure out my aesthetic. I'm just going to, figure out what it is that Bari J. Ackerman is all about. It's like you just kind of did the work, and then
I just picked things that I liked. And I think that that's important when you're making a quilt. I think that's important when you're designing a home. It's important when you're getting dressed to not overthink it, and not look into trends, and not, go with just, not try to figure it out, but just pick up the things that you like.
That's true.
And
that's true. Yeah.
I also want to comment that people should never think that any of this happened overnight, because I started making those bags like 2004. Before that, I was making jewelry and dragging that to shops and selling that to shops.
Oh, I didn't know that either. Yeah. That's so interesting. I'm learning all sorts of things about you.
From found objects, things like buttons and just various brooches and even pocket watches. And I would take watches apart. And so all of this, like, just all added up. Now, what's it
all
been?
Went to
18 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's fun to look back and to see the evolution, because it may not feel like it at the time that you are actually making headway in certain areas of creativity, but you look back and you're like, this was all
no, ma'am.
you're doing your art gallery collections,
Mhm.
which are gorgeous. I've
Thank
made
you.
some quilts with more than like 2 or 3 collections in a row, I think. And you also wrote a book, because I love that your book sort of extends what your fabric collections celebrate, which is florals and, these beautiful colors and things, and
Right.
it extends it to your home. Tell us a little bit about your book.
So it was a natural extension for me once I started doing fabric to license my art on other products, and also to produce some of my own products. And some of those are wallpaper and rugs, and there's been some dishes on the market. And I was very, very into home decor from the get go. Like one of the first reasons that I ever sewed was that I was wanting to make some cafe curtains for our very first house. So it was all about the house really initially. And then the bag, I think I was looking for a bag that was at, I think it was at J. Jill. And I was like, "Ah, that's overpriced. I'm going to make it."
Right.
And, and it was like a wool bag.
Right.
So I was like, I'm going to make that at any rate. So it was a natural extension for me to want to write a book about mixing and matching floral patterns and other patterns in the home, because it was what I was doing all. And with all of the different products that I was using, my own and then vintage, that's what propelled me to want to write the book.
Well, and your home is really sort of like your laboratory,
It
which
is.
I think is, I love that. I love that because you paint on the walls, you paint on the furniture, you cover cushions, and I love that spirit of just try it and see. Let's see what it looks like. I may change it, but it's
Hmm.
all changeable. Nothing is permanent. And yeah, it's like watching you evolve your interiors sort of made me, think hard about, we're pretty house proud, you're house proud. It's like I want it to, it doesn't, our house is really small. We had a big house in Seattle, and I like this house so much better. It's, because it's more thoughtful. We've decorated it in a more thoughtful way. And I think that, that it's fun to see personality reflected in your interiors and to create that, I think.
And I think we as quilters too, I mean, it's kind of an obvious extension for all of us to want to be decorating our homes, is because these quilts are meant for our homes.
Yeah.
They're on our beds, they're on our furniture, they're on our walls.
Yeah.
So it's
It's
a kind of a natural extension for all of us, I think.
And now you do a lot of painting and a lot of original artwork. And so you've had a lot of fun with that through the years that you and I have been friends. I've watched you, you used to do live painting on Periscope, if anybody remembers Periscope,
A periscope.
and
Yep.
good old Periscope. And, but you still continue to do that. I assume you're still doing paintings, and you do a lot and show it on Instagram and things like that.
I do. It evolved, because I was working all in the computer initially for fabric design. And at some point I took a class about licensing your art. And the teacher of that class, told us, if you're working digitally, try, you know, traditional media and vice versa. And so I started painting, and it was like this aha moment, like, oh, this is what I should have been doing all along. And it sort of is what I was doing, just digitally. And
Right.
so what I needed to learn at that point was just, the techniques of mixing the paint and using
Yeah.
real brushes and, canvases and paper. I do think that the reason I was only digital was because you can drag to the trash and throw it out.
I know.
And so, and there was no tangible evidence of like what looked horrible. Because let me tell you, when I started painting, it did look horrible. Like there was not anything great about what I first started doing. But it really evolved, and then I was like, oh, like this is it for me. Like I just want to paint. I just want to be covered in paint all the time.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting because as your skills evolved on the computer, you went back to this analog way,
Which I had never done before.
which, like you said, when you're doing an analog, you can't drag it to the trash.
You've got this piece of paper and you're like, I
yeah,
tried it. It's
unless
so
you throw it in
ugly.
but like, if you're making a quilt, and we've all got quilts that we're not happy with, they're sort of put in timeout over in the corner. I'm sure there's,
Hmm.
paintings and things that you might put in timeout just to let them percolate over in the corner. But
Hmm.
it's true. It's like as your confidence increased, you kind of went back to like this slower, more intentional process of painting versus there is an immediacy in the digital world, like in Illustrator and Photoshop, there is this immediacy. You can change the colors and you can move stuff around. And it's just, I think it engages a different part of our brain,
Right.
maybe, and
What I was going to say is when I'm doing a full painting, like say something on this wall or on a big canvas, I'm not necessarily thinking about the bits and pieces that I might be able to take out later and use for fabric. So there's that process of this vision of this whole thing. Then there's the process of designing fabric or designing wallpaper, which is more motif oriented. So I can go to a painting, scan it, and take a bit out. And then I'll just grab a piece of white, good watercolor paper and just paint on it in acrylics or watercolor. And then I'll have a bunch of different motifs. And then the process of cutting those out and putting them together. So it's really two different processes that can run the same way. But what's so fun for me is that I started digitally, went to analog, and now I'm putting it all together. So I'm cutting those out, putting them in Photoshop, changing the colors in there. And that's really the fun thing to me is that it's both things.
It's both things. And when you're painting, I know that my sister-in-law, she's a printmaker and she likes the imperfect nature of printing. And, that's part of her creative process is to embrace that. And probably the same in painting on a canvas, in your own creative mind, there are imperfections that others may not see, but that can also be, and when you're doing something digitally, you can just delete that, but you
Right.
have to kind of decide, am I going to paint over it? Am I going to paint over part of it? Am I going to leave it? Am I going to add something to it? Yeah.
I think it's harder to be imperfect in digital art. Like when you see the imperfection, it's like harder for your brain to accept that.
Yeah.
Illustrator will make your lines nice and neat. Photoshop did not or does not. And so it when I first started, it was just very hard to accept that I was a beginner and just keep going. And I never had that feeling with paint. Like I had frustration and had to get by it, but I always felt that the imperfections were really part of the process. I also
Yeah.
have a saying, which is paint through the ugly, and that can go for like almost anything in your life. So I just because there's always this point in a painting where it's just butt ugly, and it could be like 3 more strokes and you're like, ah, there it is.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So in my membership right now, we're working on a color value based scrappy quilt. And, I keep telling them my recommendation is you just do a block at a time and you make sure that within that block, you get the values right. And you may worry looking at that one block, you may worry that it's not going to work with the other blocks that you've already done. And that may,
Mhm.
but if you get the values right in that one block and then you put it together, view it in stages, then put it up on the wall and look at it with the other blocks that hopefully you've taken the time to get the values right. And, they'll often post an image with like this color or this fabric doesn't look right. And, my advice is if you don't like it, before you decide not to use it, do more of it. Just add a little more, add that fabric in a few more places, because in one block, it might be standing out and calling a lot of attention to itself, but in a whole quilt, it might actually kind of twinkle, in certain areas around the quilt. And maybe it's the same with painting too.
I think so, because you do have to find that balance. So if all of a sudden I put in this bit of yellow in a composition, and I'm like, oh gosh, now I'm gonna have to add yellow in a couple other places. But once you've got that balance, yeah, that yellow twinkles in those places.
Yeah, which I
And
think is important. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is, and it's important to have the the deep tones and the light tones
Yeah.
in a painting as well as in a quilt.
Because often I'll look at artwork, and we have more artwork in this house than we will ever have walls for. I was actually telling my husband, I'm like, we need to have like a once a year, like a complete rehanging so that we can hang up all the artwork that's like, in storage. But, I look at paintings that resonate with me, and it's often not even the subject matter as much as it is a color or a combination of two colors side by side. And there's a painting that we have in our front room that was in my in-laws entryway that I just fell in love with, and they passed away, and I asked if I could have that painting, and it's the color. I'll put an image of it in the video, but it's a sunset in New Mexico, and it's fluorescent pink, and it just is stunning, and orange, and all of these colors. And I think color is so important, and how you use it. I think it can make a painting or a quilt or something. The right amounts can make it kind of twinkle a little bit. It's fun.
It is.
And
It is.
don't
I think
follow a
that,
color wheel.
oh my gosh, no.
Don't do you
No,
do you use a color wheel?
no.
I never use a color wheel.
I had not even, I didn't even know when I started like what complementary colors were.
Well,
You know, I
I mean, one of the things that I had the option of taking in college in my major was color theory.
mhm.
And I didn't take color theory because it was an afternoon class, and I had a job at the local Esprit store. And so I wanted all my classes in the morning so I could work in the afternoon at the Esprit store. So I never took color theory. And then when I went to work in the fashion industry, it was very little to do with color theory. It was all about looking at so many other components of color, like what sold last season, what are the
Ah,
home decor trends, what are the runway colors and things like that. And I realized that I react to colors on an emotional level, and I don't feel emotional at all about a color wheel. Not at all.
no, I think that it's an innate in almost everybody to have like a visceral feeling about color.
Yeah.
And I think that when we overthink what goes together, that's when we run into problems.
Yeah.
You know, I think that we can see it. Most people can just see it if we
So
let
how
ourselves.
do you have any suggestions for people who, because I think people can hone in with a little practice on their color, like what they're drawn to and things like that. And sometimes it's hard to explain that to students or to other people, but do you have thoughts or opinions about how people can learn to just sort of
Mhm.
hone in on color that they like or don't like?
Well, the good news is that you are all sewers, because my favorite way to do it in a way that I really realized how to mix and match patterns was I was making these adorable little patchwork belts. And I was literally taking stacks of any fabric I had, vintage, new, mix and match. Nothing was from a collection together. And I would just take the stacks, I'd cut them in 4-inch squares because that's what the belt required. And I would sew them all together in a row. And I was randomly picking
Yeah,
up patches.
yeah,
And visually that looked really cool and fun to me. It just reminded me of just a scrap quilt that grandma made out of the things that she had. And I think that's where scrappy quilts started, is because people were making them out of literal scraps, not just, I'm going to make a scrappy quilt. Um, and so when I was randomly putting all of these pieces together, I was realizing that, there was a blue over here, pink, green, something, something blue. and that they were all different scales and different kinds of prints, and that was why they looked good. There was kind of like this commonality of some colors running through them, and then the contrasts were what was making it look cool.
That's
So
maybe we all need to make a belt or like just a long strip.
long strip and
Different
see like
fabrics.
where, like, okay, there's this fabric, oh, and this is a part of that same fabric, it's over here, and down the line, and you're like, oh, that looks really stinking cool.
Well, and I'm sure that you put things together that you probably wouldn't have, or maybe wouldn't have with more thought, but you were just randomly putting things together. And I think that is such a great way to find some colors sitting side by side and patterns sitting side by side that you maybe would
You
have
wouldn't have done before.
done before. Yeah,
Just
which I think
random,
is
just
so
pick it
cool.
up and sew it together, pick it up, sew it together. So whether that's making, a 9 patch or whatever,
Yeah,
just pick it up and sew it together and see what happens.
that's
I
a
mean,
great idea.
obviously when we're doing a quilt, we don't want like two pieces of the same sitting next to each other, that kind of thing, but big
Yeah,
long double
right.
block.
Do you have time to sew these days, or are you mainly painting?
I'm mainly painting these. So actually,
Yeah.
mainly I'm working on my website these days. I'm not building the website, but there's just so much back end stuff. So I'm doing a new website. So it's been a lot of work. And so I think I will sell more. My mom was very sick this past year as well. So, and we moved the prior year. So it's been kind of a
Yeah.
SHIT show. But yeah, I probably will get back more into sewing
Yeah, good,
sewing because I
good.
miss it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But now you're kind of moving more into putting your artwork on all sorts of new things. So tell us about that.
So we recently decided, my husband and I, that we wanted to focus on um, business to consumer, B2C, selling our own products. And I had already been selling the art prints, and I had some wallpapers and little things that I was selling on the website. And now we're getting more into small manufacturing. There's lots of people that already use my fabrics. And so I've been talking to, for products that they sell. So I've been talking to a lot of people about private labeling some of those, and then just small manufacturing, so that we're just doing a little bit at a time to grow it. And then we're getting the website redone, and then we're going to probably just start placing ads, because we think that that's the best way to get the brand name out there,
Build the reach. Yeah.
build
Yeah.
the reach. So we really want to make it into a brand that goes beyond fabric and beyond the reach that we have right now, and make it a household name.
I love that. Dream big. Why
Yeah,
not?
why not, right? Make it an
I mean, I think
empire.
we've seen like during the pandemic and, all of the changes in our world that came, through that. I feel like now I dream bigger because I feel like so much is possible, because I think that allowed us, or sort of forced us to think in different ways about everything, you know?
Yeah,
Kind of
it
like,
did. I
yeah.
really do feel like, anything is possible. And when I very first started and I was making the handbags, I was at the Country Living Women's Entrepreneur event, and I don't remember who was speaking, but they had us write just, I want blah, 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 blah. Like and not really even a vision, but I want, like literally I want. And I wrote, I want to build a lifestyle brand like a Kath Kidston, and it went on and on about like all the different things that I wanted in the brand, and all the things I wanted to sell. And it's very interesting because I kind of, like, with trying to license my art for lots of different things, I kind of lost control of the products that things were going on. I mean, the products that my art was going on. And now I'm like, shh, let's go back into
Narrow your
ourselves,
focus, one
and
vision.
not allow people to make things that we wouldn't be completely
Right.
proud of, and just
You're
it's just really
manifesting.
back to that vision. That was 2007, so 2007
Yeah, you're
when I
manifesting.
wrote that down. Just got to
Yeah.
manifest that crap.
You do.
It's been
You
a
really
long time, and we can lose focus. I mean, I lost focus for a long time doing sewing patterns, which was
But, you know, I
not
think
up my
you learn
alley.
lessons from all of that. You know, I had a
Oh yeah.
year, gosh, it's been a long time ago where I was like, I'm just going to paint. I just want to paint. And I was like, it was a year. And I was like, you know what? I
Out
don't
of
want
my
to,
system.
I don't want, I can't have a studio that has a lot of paint and a lot of fabric because the two are not mixing for me.
Yeah, I actually now my fabric is at home and the paint is at the studio, that is the house studio. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you have any thoughts on mixing that in the same studio because it's not easy.
No, it's not. In fact, there's some paint on the kitchen table right now, and it's no bueno. So, because I was
Well,
just
thank you. It's always fun to
Yeah.
talk to you.
it was fun to chat with you too.
Yeah. And Barry's book is called, tell us about
Bloom
your book.
Wild.
Bloom
It's called
Wild.
Bloom Wild, and it's from Abrams, and it is available wherever books are sold.
It is a beautiful book. It really is.
Thank
There's so
you.
many inspiring little takeaways from all the pages in that book. So thank you. As always, we'll see you around the interwebs, hopefully in person one of these days.
Yep.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you.